legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Thomas Lombardo, who joins us to discuss science fiction and the 2020 coronavirus crisis. Dystopian post-apocalyptic sci-fi has been one of the most prolific forms of popular entertainment in recent years. Visions of disintegrating societies, deserted cities, and scattered bands of survivors struggling to salvage these shreds of civilization have horrified and haunted viewers everywhere. Today, in the midst of the great coronavirus crisis of 2020, billions worldwide suddenly find themselves living in a surreal and disturbing version of a small-screen nightmare. But this is no zombie apocalypse or alien invasion. Instead, what we are dealing with is a pandemic of fear, confusion, and ignorance in the face of what is in fact a familiar threat as old as humanity itself. As with many fictional disasters, official rhetoric about coming together has been met by populations driven apart, and the disastrous fallout from our failure to deal appropriately with the current crisis will be felt for many years to come. Attempting to eliminate all risk for the sake of stability and safety is anti-evolutionary and can lead only to stasis and stagnation. In the best science fiction stories, however, we can find wisdom to help navigate these troubling times, and in the true meaning of apocalypse, a revelation or unveiling, find positive growth and transformation for the future of the human race.
Utopia.
Hello and welcome, Tom, and thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Yes, thank you. It's really good being here, Greg.
This is your third time with us, Tom, and today we're going to be having a very interesting discussion because we're recording this, of course, as if anyone needs reminding, in the midst of the coronavirus crisis of 2020. It'll be interesting for anybody listening to this 5, 10, 15, 20 years time, thinking back to how that all panned out. In any event, before we jump into our discussion, just for listeners who don't know, just briefly tell them a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yes. I'm the director of the Center for Future Consciousness in the Phoenix, Arizona metro area. I've been a professional futurist for about 25 years. My PhD, though, is in psychology. I write books about the future, about future consciousness. I have a very strong interest in write material on science fiction. I'm interested in the future evolution of the human mind. I was a college professor for 30 years and was involved in the initiative to teach wisdom at a college level to students and a few other things.
So I would say, to get started, a way of perhaps summarizing or at least getting started on our discussion would be to say that we're going to be looking at, and this is a quote from something that you published recently, the value of science fiction in understanding our present world crisis, and more generally, the value of science fiction in imagining and thinking about the future. Because for many people, consciously and unconsciously, what's happening at the minute feels a little bit like waking up in the middle of a dystopian sci-fi movie, one of those typical Walking Dead type things, or not quite post-apocalyptic, but certainly, the world's been turned on its head and everything's a bit strange. And people, of course, are dealing with this in lots of different ways, or failing to deal with it in lots of different ways. But you're bringing your quite unique futurist and your depth knowledge of science fiction to this as a different way of looking at it.
Yeah, we can imagine that we are presently characters in a science fiction disaster novel. And in a lot of ways, it is similar to disaster novels that have been written in science fiction. Science fiction has written disaster novels about all kinds of different physical, natural, man-made disasters. In fact, lots of them about plagues, too, for that matter. And so if one imagines that that's the kind of scenario that we're in, then what do these different novels that have been written in the past tell us about the kinds of ways in which a disaster will unfold, possibilities? They inform us as to how would it feel to live through a significant worldwide disaster. So I wrote an article, actually did a YouTube to begin with, on the value of science fiction in getting an understanding of what's going on, having some resources for figuring out how it would feel, and what do we do about it? How do we address it? How do we cope with it? And there's lots and lots of different voices on this, of course. But there's been lots of different science fiction novels about disasters too, and lots of different characters in those disaster novels.
Yes, I mean, indeed, the history of science fiction is replete with the sort of scenarios that you were hinting at there, and the sort of things that what we find happening outside of our windows today are sort of vaguely reminiscent of. I mean, probably like from War of the Worlds onwards, really. I mean, there are so many to think about. The Andromeda Strain. If we think about those that particularly involve plagues or, diseases, Andromeda Strain is one of the best known. Earth Abides, The Stand, Outbreak is a movie. Outbreak's a movie. I don't know if Outbreak was ever a book, and also Contagion was a recent movie. I don't know if that was ever a book. You've got recent ones, Severance, Station 11, 28 Days Later, I Am Legend. Even some of these zombie movies filter into this as well. So it's almost not the entire history of sci-fi, but maybe certainly since the Industrial Revolution onwards, there's been this strain, I think, of like, what if all of this came undone very suddenly?
Yes, in fact, if the reader goes to my website, Center for Future Consciousness, and looks at the article, it's in the Wisdom and the Future newsletter archives. I have a list in there of about 15 or 20 famous science fiction disaster novels that have been written over the last 100 or so years that I think are very interesting and informative. War of the Worlds, which you mentioned, is important. And keep it in mind that in War of the Worlds, it's aliens who invade us, but it's an out-of-the-blue scenario. While everybody is going about their daily business and is calm and relaxed and feels as if there's no imminent disaster or danger afoot, then all of a sudden, boom, the Martians invade us. And a lot of people felt like everything was sort of relatively normal, and then in a very short period of time, the coronavirus hits us, boom, out of the blue. Now, people, of course, have predicted through the decades that we could be hit with a significant global pandemic. But that's part of the scenario of science fiction disaster novels, which is that the scientists will usually say, the comet is going to hit us. We're going to have a gigantic upheaval in our ecological stability. The Martians are coming, but nobody believes them. And then, of course, when the comet hits, then everybody goes scrambling around. So that's one of the elements in science fiction disaster novels, that out of the blue, the scientists say something's going to happen. Nobody believes them, and then boom, it happens.
Yeah, well, we'll get to some of the political dimensions of this shortly. One of the interesting things about War of the Worlds is, of course, the Martian invaders are ultimately undone by something very small, not by human efforts really, but by bacteria.
Right.
The common cold. And in many ways, for a lot of people, they're facing this virus pandemic at the moment. And for a lot of people, and this is the mainstream ignorance about this is quite astounding. A lot of people don't even know really what a virus is. They don't understand that virus is generally not regarded as being alive. It has no, independent life of its own. And they're looking at this thing as very much an alien invader. So in the scenario we're living in, it's like the coronavirus is almost like the Martians in a way.
Yeah. Actually, the twist on it is that in the War of the Worlds, It's something at the microscopic level that helps us and defeats the enemy. But now it's something at a microscopic level that is the enemy and is invisible on top of it all. So part of the uniqueness of this particular invasion scenario, we're being invaded. That's what's happening. Our bodies are being invaded, and the enemy has been spreading out. But in this case here, the enemy is very tiny and very invisible as opposed to big spaceships or dangerous ray guns. But it's still lethal at the same time. And in fact, to put an extra little spin on it, a famous science fiction writer named Edmund Hamilton back in the 1930s wrote a science fiction a story in which beings who lived at a microscopic level relative to us enlarged themselves up to our level of reality and invaded us. So we could look to the sky and worry about the Martians coming, but all around us there are dangerous things that may all of a sudden come popping into our presence and undo us in one manner or form. In this case here, we have viruses. You also said something about the fact that people in general don't even understand what a virus is. Well, part of the problem there is simply that we have a strong anti-scientific element in the general population. How well does the general population understand science? And science fiction involves scientific concepts. In this case here, we're talking about plagues. Well, what are plagues? How do they spread? Why is it that a virus can't exist on its own? What does that mean? What's the difference between virus and bacteria? But if we have a skeptical or rather ignorant attitude towards science, then it does take us by surprise. And maybe we don't understand what to do about it. And here we are, 2 months, at least 3 months, 4 months into this scenario now.
You've reminded me of something very, very interesting, a central theme that runs throughout. It's one of George Romero's famous zombie films, and it's the third of his famous trilogy. I don't know if these qualify as science fiction enough for you to take an interest in. It's kind of science fiction horror, I suppose. But in Day of the Dead, so there's Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead. In Day of the Dead, the survivors of the zombie apocalypse find themselves ensconced in a military bunker underground. They have captured a couple of the zombies, and the scientific elements down there are doing experiments with the zombies to try and see if they can be domesticated, can they be trained, can they be somehow neutralized. And the tension between the scientific community and the survivor group and the military element spills over into violence eventually. The military are very intolerant of the scientific element. They want patience. They want to be able to analyze the situation, find out what to do. The military want to blast the hell out of everything. And for me, that reminds me of a lot of the famous science fiction stories about disasters, is that as a species, we seem to be good at defending ourselves when it's a sort of Independence Day type threat, if it's saucers in the sky. But when it's something you can't see, you can't smell, whether it's a virus, whether it's bacteria, whether it's radiation, these are things that are all, they're almost so much more insidious in a way, because you can't just get up and wallop them or just, shoot them down.
Yeah, there's lots of different angles on the comments you just made, Greg. Number one is you're going to find a lot of similarities between zombie movies and various types of science fiction. Zombie movies could be considered to be supernatural in their foundation, but they'll still have lots of elements in them that would be similar to, say, hideous alien invaders that come upon us, and how we react to them versus how we react to zombies. In I Am Legend science fiction, a science fiction novel, there is a certain population of remaining humanity that become like monsters. But that's due to, in fact, something scientific. I forget if it was a bacteria or a virus that infected them. So there's going to be a lot of overlap between science fiction, some science fiction, and in horror movies. then after you were talking about the horror dimension, there was something else you brought up. Oh, I know what it was. Okay. How do we react to an adversary? And you mentioned the scientific mind, and you mentioned the military mind, and you could also throw in the political mind or the religious mind. There's going to be lots of different mindsets. Now, I remember in the movie, The Thing from Another World, the scientists wanted to study the alien. The military figures wanted to kill it, get it out of there, And in that case, the military figures come off looking like the wise ones because the scientists try to raise new offspring of the alien. And foolishly, a bunch of them die because of it. So yeah, different people are going to have different approaches to this. I mean, how do you deal with a microscopic, invisible threat? And you can't, in this case here, use big guns to blow it up. You got to use something else. Some kind of human ingenuity, and it's also got to involve science, whatever it is.
I'm also reminded of the second in the Alien movie franchise, Aliens, directed by James Cameron. And there you see the tension between the scientific and the military. And it's very similar to what you just said. The military, they get Ripley back out of stasis, and eventually she's persuaded to go to this planet. And she's like, we're going there to wipe them out, not to bring back, not to study. The corporate scientific guy is like, yeah, that's the plan, and of course the agenda all along is to weaponize, or to attempt to weaponize the alien species. And of course, one of the theories going around at the minute, because of course this is a field day for conspiracy theorists, but we know for a fact that viruses and bacteria, sometimes very highly dangerous ones, such as smallpox and Ebola, are studied and worked on and, cultivated in highly secure labs. So the kind of Andromeda strain, a bit of, there's an overlap once again between science fiction and science fact.
Yeah, in fact, bringing up the conspiracy approach or conspiracy view of the present reality, as you recall, and a lot of the listeners probably have seen it as well, in 12 Monkeys, the movie, there's a character in there that releases a deadly, extremely deadly, I forget if it's a virus or bacteria, onto the world intentionally and wipes out almost all of humanity. So that was an intentional, infectious action that he took there. And then, of course, we have the time travel element that goes on in 12 Monkeys too. But for a long time, people have thought about and considered biological weapons of different kinds. And we've had science fiction stories about them. We've had ones in which something accidentally gets loose or intentionally is released. And of course, we would have people with the view right now, maybe this was somehow intentionally released. Another thing I say in the article, by the way, and this is what creates part of the problem, is that when you have a disaster, you have many different voices, many different opinions, and many different interpretations of what is going on. And lots and lots of different groups have lots of their own way of looking at it, and they believe, this is what's happening, and this is how we should look at it. And so we have this a kind of riot of interpretations. There's not just one, there's many, many different ones.
I was talking earlier on about, I'm just throwing this in before I forget, George Romero's Dead trilogy. He did a little-known film with the theme of a bacterial agent being released and the containment efforts that go on, by the military and the authorities in general, and the effect it has on the civilian population. The film's called Thecrazies. I don't know if you've seen that, but I'd recommend it to anyone who hasn't.
Yes, obviously, there have been lots of different types of stories written about this. And again, just to go back to one thing here, is that in a convincing science fiction or even zombie horror-like narrative story, you're going to have lots of different characters who are competing with each other over how to address the problem. Reality is never that simple where, it's an X, and in order to deal with X, we do Y, and everybody says yes, because it doesn't happen that way. Right now, we have different factions with different interpretations, competing against each other, pushing against each other, actually arguing with each other over how to deal with this disaster. That makes it especially messy. But in a good disaster novel, a good science fiction disaster novel, you'll see that. We're not going to end up agreeing on what the best way is to deal with this. The scientists in the military may not agree. The politicians may not agree with the doctors. The paranoids may not agree with the neurotics. God knows, there'll be multiple voices. And that's part of the whole tension and excitement. And I don't mean excitement in a positive way, but I mean the tension and the agitation of the whole reality. There's people who say this is a good thing. It's stopped us driving our cars all over the place so much. The air is cleaner. My wife doesn't have to commute through rush hour traffic every day. She works at home, makes it calmer. We don't spend as much money because you can't go into stores and buy anything. There's all these changes going on that you can interpret and some people have as positive things. So when you come out of a disaster, there's the idea, well, let's get back to the way things were, but there's also the idea, maybe things weren't that great before, and maybe this is a good kick in the butt, and maybe this will get us to change our ways.
Well, in terms of the idea that I hinted at the top of the hour about science fiction as a way for people to frame their experiences at the moment, on social media and just on the interwebs experience in general, there's been a lot of people have been talking about, I've been watching such and such a movie, citing some of the ones that we've been talking about. I've been binging on this box set, whatever it happens to be, again, sci-fi, dystopia. And I'm sure that without having had a lot of detailed conversations with people, I'm sure a lot of them are seeing them differently now. And maybe it will help them process some of what's going on. Because for a lot of people, sci-fi is just chewing gum for the eyes. It's just kind of like fluff. It has little bearing on their lives. But I'm sure some people are looking at some of these stories now, some of these narratives, the characters, how they process what's happening around them and what's happening to them. And are thinking about, how has this got, maybe this is some kind of new relevance for my daily life.
Yes, of course. And science fiction takes you beyond the immediate here and now and the relatively normal. It pushes your consciousness out, away from that. And Arthur C. Clarke, the great science fiction writer, even said that, science fiction is really a dive into deep reality. It's getting outside of the narrow confines of status quo, everyday consciousness, and having to look at the big picture of things. So it might on one hand seem like escapism or fluff, but on the other hand, it's really penetrating down deeper into the nature of things. We're an island of stability in a giant ocean of change. And for a period of time, things were relatively stable. Now they've become unsettled again. But becoming unsettled is a normal kind of thing within the great panorama and history of nature. We're in a punctuated equilibrium state now. We're in something significant could be happening. And it's relevant for us to see that. And you could see that through science fiction. And you could see how people deal with it through science fiction. We might be asking ourselves, and I just want to comment one last thing you said. We might be asking ourselves, well, what are the leaders going to do? What are the experts going to do? But part of the real issue is, what are you going to do individually? How are you going to make it through this challenge, this crisis? And in what sense could this be an opportunity for you to change individually? And I don't mean simply you survived the disaster. You come out better on the other end than you went into it. And that's part of what makes for a good science fiction novel, too. You mentioned Earth Abides, which is fantastic, a great story about a plague and disaster and the remaking of humanity afterwards. That one I highly recommend people to read. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, that's something that, how we can benefit. I don't want to, use any other word. How we can take a positive from this is something that we will get to again before we close. If quantum theory is correct, then the ground of reality is some kind of churning chaos from which the order that you and I and this world that we're in for a short time, the order that we're part of, but it all then collapses back into that swirling chaos again. So the sea of chaos is the natural state.
I totally resonate with you on that perspective on reality. I'm not saying that I totally believe this, but it's highly probable that we are simply relatively persistent, semi-crystallized stabilities floating on a bubbling, agitating, percolating foam of flux. And we freeze up for a while. We acquire this stability, this material form. But the underneath of the whole thing is bubbling. And sometimes we forget that. Everything in our body is in a sense of vibration. We're controlled vibrations. And so we get used to the fact that things are calm and easy. But then reality breaks through and it bubbles up. The volcano explodes. The meteorite hits. The bug gets loose. The mad scientist makes the crazy robot, whatever.
If you allow for the philosophy known as idealism, which essentially is that the universe is mental, that all is within consciousness, and then if physical reality that you and I appear to be part of, if that is the mind attempting to crystallize into form, to use your word crystallize, then in the terms of like the long span of time, then we may be the universe, we may be mind crystallizing into form at a very, very early stage. So therefore it's still very unstable. And it may be that trillions of years in the future that maybe material form as we understand it will be more stable. But there's no reason to think that we're it, which is, I guess, our lives are so short that I think a lot of human beings get convinced that not only are we the alpha and omega of kind of existence, but that also we've arrived at, if not at an omega point, then certainly at some kind of plateau of stability. But of course, that's partly due to, as I say, how brief our lives are, and also our lack of a sense of history and how things have gone before, and also how uncommon this sort of stability actually is, which is something you mentioned a moment ago.
Yeah, I'm going to generally agree with what you're saying and add to it. Number one, we are part of a process of evolution. To think of ourselves as a final omega state or or perfected state is highly misleading. We're on a journey. And part of what science fiction does is that science fiction pulls you back in time so you could see different parts of that journey, possibilities out there in the future, transformations out in the future. So people have a need for stability, and there is relative stability. For the moment, I'm staying Tom Lombardo and integrated and whole, and so are you staying Greg Moffat and integrated and whole. But you'll eventually fall apart, and so will I, and so will everything around me. So overall, there's this continual growth and development and evolution, and where we're at right now is only a step along the way. It's nothing which is permanent and absolute at all. And that's something science fiction definitely reveals, that the transformational nature of reality.
One thing about the trajectory of sci-fi stories, I mentioned earlier about how certainly from the Industrial Revolution onwards, there were people who, yes, as much as they marveled at what was unfolding and the constant, discovery of new technological wonders and new conveniences, I just wonder if is it almost as a species and via some of these futurist thinkers in the past and writers, whether we kind of intuited some of the ways that we could get into problems. Because as early as 1909, you had, The Machine Stops was published, And I've drawn that book and that story to a few people's attention recently, and they've been amazed that something could be so prescient. So I just feel that for a long time we were concerned, and as quite often happens, it comes out through fiction, and particularly if it's concerned about the future, it's science fiction, that we understood that there was a potential dark side to what was going on, that we would need to be careful, we'd need to be mindful in how we developed our technologies.
Yeah, we need to be mindful and careful about everything we do in a sense, obviously. Yes, the machine stops for being written in the early part of the 20th century seems exceedingly prescient. And there should be both positive and inspiring, as well as nihilistic or fearful and apprehensive science fiction visions. Both sides of the coin are important. We have to have a sense of hope and optimism and a sense of capacity to improve things, but we also have to have a sense of perspective on what the consequences could be of doing this, or the consequences could be of doing that. Whether it's with technology, with the environment, whether transforming ourselves, which we do in various ways also. So both sides of that are significant, weighing the pros, weighing the cons, and feeling them, experiencing them in fictitious realities. Yes, and science fiction does that quite a bit. So would it be good to go back to the way things were? Would it be good to change now? What are the different possibilities? What are the pros and cons?
Now, you're currently, oh, by the way, this would be a good point to mention, actually, that, I mentioned this is your third time on with us. So the two previous interviews, that we did together will be of great interest to anybody who's, listening to this. People can find the links for both those interviews on the webpage for this one, but you're currently, working your way through a series of books, science fiction, the evolutionary mythology of the future.
Right.
So you have a deep, deep knowledge and understanding of the history of science fiction in all its guises. I've read a lot of sci-fi, nowhere near as much as you, but my sort of overarching impression is that there's been more dystopias written than utopias. If we also count the utopias that, of course, turn out to be dystopias in any way, like sort of Handmaid's Tale type thing and Brave New World, etc., etc. They're projected as utopias. Do you think that is an accurate impression? And if so, is it simply that we, as a species, again, we have a tendency towards drama? We look at the prevalence of soap operas and what have you. Everything has to be a drama. Nothing can happen without conflict and excitement and, whatever it happens to be, tension. So is that just a species thing, or is there a reason why these tales, these sort of cautionary tales, or outright kind of warnings seem to prevail over those that say, we can reach a point of thus far unprecedented harmony and balance as a species with our environment?
Yeah, couple things on that. There are people who would say, and I guess I would agree to a significant degree, that more dystopias are written now than used to be written relative to utopias. That is, people maybe wrote more utopias before and less dystopias before, and then around the 1930s, 1920s, 30s, 40s, dystopias went on the rise. Part of the reason for that was that we had two world wars, and we had the rise of fascism, the rise of communism, the rise of other kinds of authoritarian governments that seemed to indicate that even though we believed we were engaged in progress and things were getting better, perhaps we were still in various ways too primitive and stupid and screwing things up one way or another, and we shouldn't be so optimistic because look all the millions of people we killed in these wars. So we had a depressing time in the mid-20th century, which may have led to increasing dystopias. It's funny, though, that I was introduced to Brave New World, the novel, as a dystopia. And I read it when I was young and saw it as a dystopia. When I read it again, it hit me that you could look at it as a disguised utopia, that the leading character that ran North America, he was the convincing one at the end. You know, do you want to be happy or do you want to have your freedom and be miserable? And that was a question he posed to the savage in Brave New World. So sometimes it's not that clear what's a utopia and what's a dystopia, but there definitely seems to be more of it. You're also correct in that dystopias will generate more excitement and greater special effects and more misery than will utopias. So you could have a much more exciting and dramatic story if it's a bleak one than if it's a positive, harmonizing type of story. That's there too. But we need our utopias. We need to be able to articulate positive visions for the future and not just negative ones, because utopias and dystopias are reflections of optimism and pessimism as general psychological states about the future. And optimism and pessimism have self-fulfilling prophecy effects. And what that means is that if one anticipates things going wrong, that increases the chances that they will. It doesn't guarantee it, but increases the chances. If you expect things to go better, it increases the chances that they will. It's not true that where there's a will, there's a way, but if there ain't no will, there ain't no way. So being optimistic and writing positive visions is a good thing. And we have a lot of the dark stuff now. And maybe we have a lot of the dark stuff now because collectively we think that the world is going to hell and we can't seem to figure out a viable, convincing, inspiring future for us. And so we write all these dark novels.
Yeah, listeners can find a lot more on this in our interview on your book, Future Consciousness, about, how our thinking can shape our future. I mean, it stands to reason to me and to you, but not to everyone. Now, of course, at the moment, as you say, there's a lot of negative noise around, and we're living in a culture of fear. Some people have argued, I'm going to have a guest on it next week who's going to be arguing just this, that the majority of the 20th century has been dominated by a gathering culture of fear. We're erring on the side of caution because of fear, so we're not having expansive visions. We're not taking risks because we're afraid. We'd rather just know that nothing will go wrong, or try and make nothing, try to allow that nothing will go wrong, but also that nothing will happen. And so right now, whether it's from the mainstream media, from social media, from our politicians, from economists and other people with ists at the end of their title, and even from the science community now on this, there's so much, not only conflicting information, but a lot of negative stuff. And I think, and again, some people just say, well, it is negative, man, but that's true. But without context, I mean, what do you do with all this data, with all this information that appears to be overwhelmingly negative, if you have no context, if you can't even process it to assess how bad things really are, then what can you do with that?
Yeah. I thought of a couple things as you were saying all of that, and at the end there, what popped into my head was Albert Robito's classic 19th century science fiction novel called The 20th Century. And Robito, as a prescient science fiction writer, predicted that the news would become entertainment in the 20th century, and that the news and media and high-tech media would merge together, and, people would be excited and entertained every day watching big screens showing all the disasters going on in the world. So today we find news and media which highlights disaster and mayhem and trouble, and we're inundated with it. We don't get really that much of the progress that's going on along many different dimensions. You may or you may not be aware, 2 years ago, Steven Pinker came out with his book about how in many ways the world is actually getting better, but we don't pay attention to all the ways it's getting better. Jerome Glenn in the Millennium Project, which is a futurist organization, points out that 3/4 of the fundamental measuring points for quality of life in the world are improving. Only about 1/4 are actually going down. But we hold on to the negative stuff. The media grabs hold on to the negative stuff. People, you could ask, why are people attracted to fear? Why are they attracted to the dark side? This starts to sound like Star Wars, or something. Why do we go look for the devil in things? But Frankenstein, one of the first science fiction novels, she went looking for the devil too, and found it, in her neurotic scientist who ran away from his creation and caused mayhem and misery because he tried to play God. So that's going on too.
Quite a few people I know who say they like to read sci-fi. What they actually enjoy is it's fantasy, or is what was known at one time as science fantasy. So, for example, like Michael Moorcock. So it's a bit of a hybrid. And then when you look at what you might call hard sci-fi, a lot of people for all the people who love it, a lot of people are turned off it because they think that it's engaging really just with science and technology, and it's for geeks, it's for Star Trek, it's for people, Babylon 5 and blah, 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 on and on. But as you yourself mention, in your recent piece that you mentioned earlier, there's social, political and psychological factors at work in any disaster. And of course, we're seeing that writ large now. And all sorts of every character that you can imagine in any other sort of novel, every sort of character that you or I or anyone listening to this can imagine in their daily lives, the people they work with, the people in their family, all the sorts of characters that they come into contact with and interact with, to a greater or lesser extent, they are all represented as well, so that the best sci-fi story is involving humanity has that human dimension, and it's quite often what the story hinges on is how that interfaces with whatever the unknown happens to be, good or bad.
Oh yeah. You definitely need to have good characters in your novel, or else even if you have very deep scientific ideas or really way out technological ideas, it doesn't work as a story. What you got to do is you got to synthesize together as a good writer good characters, good psychology, good social interaction, that human dimension with the strange and the scientific and the technological. Good science fiction writers do that. And in fact, good disaster novels do that too, repeatedly so. So you have these different dimensions that are studied and worked out and thought through in classic science fiction, disasters. Yes, for sure. Science fiction is about the future of everything and pulling it all together.
Further to what I mentioned earlier about science fiction perhaps helping to guide people through their thoughts and feelings at this time, whether they feel there's any direct analogues between their science fiction story they might be reading and what's happening. There's certainly a lot of people are very unsettled and unnerved about what's happening to what they felt was the stability of society and the certainty that was all around them. And in the best science fiction stories that I've read, I would find myself putting the book down at certain points because I needed time to process what I was reading, what I was feeling, what I was understanding, vicariously through the characters. And the best novels do that. So for critics of sci-fi, especially lazy critics of sci-fi, it was always like, well, yeah, it's not really a novel, is it? It's not Wuthering Heights, or it's not, they'd name all the classic sort of novels in English literature and say, well, it's not that, but of course, you can probably reel off examples of exemplary novel craft and characterization and every other dynamic that goes into the art of the novel in a science fiction context. So where I'm going with this is just that how it feels for the characters in a sci-fi film to live through triumph and tragedy, adversity, all of the things that we experience in everyday lives. The characters there go through, even if the context is bizarre and alien and unimaginable to us, it's still a human reaction to it.
Yes, in fact, I would say that when we look around, we should attempt to live wisdom narratives, Because in science fiction disaster novels, and just in science fiction in general, you often find wisdom narratives. That is where the main characters facing something really bizarre, transformative, different, have to grow and develop as a person in dealing with that strange and bizarre reality. Like Ender, in Ender's Game and The Speaker of the Dead, that's a definite wisdom narrative set in a science fiction context. And The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson is a great wisdom narrative of a young girl set in the context of upheaval and change. So there's lots of really good wisdom narratives. And when we think about ourselves, we think about how we might live a wisdom narrative in dealing with this struggle and with this challenge. And indeed, people who are judged as wisest in terms of their own minds and characters are people who have had to successfully deal with the extraordinary, with big challenges, with big crises. And so science fiction lays out big challenges, bizarre crises, and different kinds of realities, and people will persevere through them. And I also just want to mention is the one thing you said about novels. I always tell people, if you think science fiction isn't great literature, read Hyperion by Dan Simmons. Read A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter Miller. Those two always pop into my head because those are great, great novels, great characterizations, great stories. And The Canticle for Leibowitz is about a disaster on top of it all.
Well, in that light, actually, again, a little quote from I think it's from your essay, certainly from you. Psychological studies on the development of wisdom seem to indicate that wisdom grows through trauma, adversity, and transformation, being successfully faced and assimilated into one's psyche. So from what you're saying about what we can hope to or aspire to take away from what's happening right now, this is like, it's a teachable moment, isn't it, really?
Yes, it is. Teachable. It's a moment of learning. This is a time to learn. When things are constant, when things don't change, you don't learn shit. Excuse my expression, right? Right. It's when things are new, when things are different, that you are forced into having to be flexible and change and grow and learn. So if everything were calm and taken care of, in fact, another great science fiction a story called Mother by Philip Jose Farmer, is a story about a man who has everything taken care of for him, and everything is calm and peaceful and beautiful by this nurturing alien. And the man turns into a vegetable by the time it's over, because we need adversity in order to grow. And so in this case here, we have adversity. How would it be? How would it feel if nothing ever went wrong? Our minds would die.
Well, and that's exactly the scenario in some of the science fiction utopias that are actually dystopias. It's of stasis. You can think of the Time Machine, with the Eloi. How pathetic they appear. And there's also one of the recent science fiction novels I read was Methuselah's Children.
Oh yeah, Robert Heinlein. Of
course. And when I won't give away the plot, but when the breakaway human species leave the Earth and search for a new home, one of the planets they visit is an apparent utopia where there's no needs, no desires, there's no nothing really, but the creatures there, they stay there for a short pleasant time, but the creatures there are kind of pathetic really, they just lie around and nothing happens. That's a sort of stasis that is anti-evolutionary, and you mentioned earlier the concept of punctuated equilibrium. That's part of evolutionary theory, and the idea there, for people who don't know, is that, we're coasting along, and then suddenly something occurs, and it marks quite a step change in the evolution of a species or of an ecosystem, whatever it happens to be. And there's a lot of evidence that that's happened in the past. So you can make parallels between that and certainly the potential for our species of moments like the one we're living in now.
Yeah, like, for example, I would recommend Greg Beer's Darwin's Radio for a good look at applying punctuated equilibria to science fiction and the future evolution of humanity. Great book, Darwin's Radio. And you do bring up something about utopian visions. H.G. Wells realized this 100 years ago. You can't have a realistic and viable utopian image that is static, that stays the same. You have to incorporate into it the notion of continual growth and transformation and change. That is, if you imagine the perfect world, heaven, and nothing changes, it becomes hell. Yeah, it's a death. So we don't want everything perfect and harmonious. We don't ride on harmony. We ride on chaos. And we achieve order, and order is great, and too much chaos kills you and all of that. But you have to incorporate into an ideal vision the idea that it's going to keep moving and changing and growing. If you don't, then it's not a utopia. It's anti-human. It's a cell that you're stuck in.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of movements, especially environmental movements, and some also who overlap with ideas of reforming economics, and also, in the area of energy and resource use, they talk about stability and stasis, like the idea of a resource-based economy, of 100% sustainability, the idea that things can be just managed on a fairly static basis, or certainly on a basis where inputs match outputs, right. And just like that idea. But to my mind, anyway, that would be fine and dandy as a stable background from which to move forward, if you see what I mean. But it's not kind of an end in itself, because no. I have this, and I've talked about with many different thinkers and writers about their perspective on this particular idea, but I've always felt that, and this is certainly a human-centric way to think about things, but I include the rest of life on this planet in this, and indeed life in the universe, that I've always felt that we're supposed to be doing something. And by doing something, I don't necessarily mean consuming and building and going places, but that life isn't random, and that there is some kind of natural teleology. So the idea of everything just being managed on a stable basis, as I say, fine background from which to work, but not an end in itself.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even agree with you that it's a fine background in which to work, because I don't think it's realistic or good. That is, I will often say to people, to get a rise and to get a debate going, I'll say that sustainability is a misconceptualized ideal. And it's misconceptualized in that it is unrealistic, and it'll never work, and it misses the fundamental evolutionary quality of reality in human existence. We don't want sustainability. What we want is thoughtful, wise evolution and flourishing. We don't want to stand still. We don't want to destroy things, of course, but we want to be evolving ourselves as opposed to maintaining ourselves. And reality will always come in and kick you underneath. I went to the biosphere when they first created it down in near Tucson, Arizona, which was supposed to be a self-contained, relatively stable inner environment of several environments. And the damn thing wouldn't stand still, literally. It kept transforming on the engineers. Nature will not stand still. The only way we make something stand still, keep it stable, is to put it in a cage. And it still won't even quite work that way. So, that's another whole topic, the topic of sustainability. But we're back to the theme about changing, and back to the theme of transformation. Now science fiction gets at that. And right now we're in a period of transformation. And a lot of people really hope that perhaps it's enough of a jolt that it'll change things for humanity at large, instead of just simply trying to go back to the good old days, which the good old days weren't all that good anyway.
Sustainability is, I know you say it's a separate conversation, which is true, and it could be, but it is very relevant because it feeds into the big question, which right now is, what are we going to do next? Where do we go from? Yeah, is it going to be 100% sustainability? You say no, that's fine. So that's all part of that's what we need. That's what we need to work out.
Yeah, that's part of the discussion. Yes, exactly. But I think it would be an unwise move to try to go back to where we were before the Coronapocalypse. By the way, apocalypse, which gets used to mean a great disaster, originally meant a great enlightenment. And the disaster produces, there's an enlightenment and disaster. So right now, this could be seen as an opportunity for enlightenment, for us seeing the big picture better. And I hope we don't try to go back to where we were before.
There's a number of trends and tendencies that were already in place, of course, have been for decades, certainly since the latter years of the 20th century, but I'm seeing making a resurgence now. Those are such things as, localism versus globalism. The idea that we'll get back right now is a good argument for more local production, local consumption, local everything, really. Smaller organizations, smaller entities, which are less, that are more stable, apparently, depending on who you talk to. There's the idea of, the retro future, where simpler technology, less complex technology, less breakable technology, more easy to understand technology from, tried and tested could be redeployed as we move forward. You might feel that's a bit atavistic. So, then of course there's a lot of people as well who are also saying, essentially, to sum it up, I hate my job, but I wish I could get up tomorrow, Monday morning at 6 a.m. to commute to my job. So a lot of people desperate because I mentioned they're so unnerved and so unsettled by all this. They do want to get back to business as usual as quick as possible. So there's those competing trends, some of which I think are just out and out negative, like the instant return to business as usual, which I see is absolutely impossible, utterly undesirable. And then there's some other well-meaning tendencies and trends which are trying to say, okay, we do need to move forward, but, maybe the phrase I used in an email to you was maybe that the scale of the human enterprise needs to be reduced, scaled back.
Yeah, this is a ongoing process. It's dawned to me a long time ago. There are many, many different theories of the future. There are many different spokespeople with different preferred visions for the future. And the future unfolds as a kind of Darwinian dialogue with competition and cooperation among those diverse points of view. So what's going to come out of this is going to be an effect of this interaction among all those different points of view. With nature, of course, giving us kicks in various ways along the way.
Now, I wanted to ask you about the future of space exploration. The reason being is because something that's of particular interest to me, and the reason somebody listening to this might be saying, oh, why has he suddenly introduced this? But, for example, one of the big trends just prior to this pandemic in the press was, so like a new space age. There was a dawning of a new space age with all these commercial and other, intergovernmental players coming in, and people like Elon Musk and others, others getting involved, and a lot of very exciting hyperbole about what might be achievable in the future. And Elon Musk wanted 1 million people on Mars by 2050. And whatever you feel about that, and however progress is being made. So I just wondered, there are already people who are, consigning things like that, if not to the history books, then certainly to the putting it on the shelf. And I want to get your perspective on it, because there are other people who are saying, now's not the time to take developments like that off the table. Yes, we do have a very immediate issues to deal with right here, right now, but we're shutting down economies worldwide. But we shouldn't forget about our future, I suppose, is a simple way to put it.
Yeah, I'm definitely pro space technology and space exploration and its continued development. I think that one thing global disasters should teach us is that here we all are living on one big spinning ball of rock. But that's it. It's important for us to spread out, at least some level of spread to other locations, or else we're just entirely vulnerable here. Disaster novels and science fiction point out that the right circumstances could just knock out all human life or most of it on the earth. Okay. So we need to spread. We need to find a way to spread. Secondly, it's a positive growth image. Thirdly, we learned a lot about the earth and the ecology of the earth by going out into space. What satellites have done for us in the monitoring of the earth and seeing the earth. So I think that part of the innovative push in the future should not be to back off from space exploration and colonization, to get out to Mars, whatever, and however many people that would be, to get back out into the moon, and to keep that going. That of course has been one of the big dreams of science fiction and continues to be a big dream of science fiction. Some people would say we shouldn't be doing that. We should focus on here, right around this. But the fact is, here, right around this we're all just simply right here on the earth, and getting out there will give us a better chance of surviving given a disaster down here, and will give us a better understanding of down here.
Obviously, you know why I'm asking you this, because I sent you an article that I'd written. There was no doubt in my mind that for some people, the idea of moving off planets or the idea of radical enhancement technologies for the species, whether they be, merging with AI or transhumanist ideas, whatever, that these, for some people, were a way of projecting, a way of rejecting deeper psychological issues that would first need to be resolved before any of these new ideas could be successfully explored, in my opinion. So it's like, don't try to sort of graduate before you've done the study, or however you want to put it. So
Right. And I think that we would be obviously much more successful in our movement out into space if we were more collectively together.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yes, we would be much more successful at it. But at the same time, how long do we wait for that? I mean, you could say, hey, we're going to just take our problems from here and transport them over there. Yeah, maybe, maybe not. I mean, Europe didn't get its act together before it decided to move over to the Americas and plop down over here. And we made some progress in doing that. We did some new experiments. I like Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, because in there they do a new experiment with human civilization on Mars. It's very realistically portrayed. Even the Martian Chronicles in its own way has that same notion. You know, we didn't quite get it right down here. We still haven't quite got it right. But maybe if we try to do something a bit different over here, a bit different over there, we may make a step forward in a positive direction. And if you think we're going to have to be perfect down here before we go out there, maybe it'll never happen. Maybe it won't. If the meteorite is going to hit and we better get off of the planet, we'll come together fast enough, no matter how neurotic we are, and get the hell out. Yeah, at least get ourselves someplace else. At least some humanity someplace else. What was that movie that just came out? The one from the Chinese science fiction writer, Wandering Earth, was an interesting movie. The one who did the three-body problem, and they made a movie out of the Wandering Earth. And they had to move the Earth, which is not the first time that's been done in science fiction, just to move the whole Earth.
Well, I guess in the light of what you just said, one of my concerns about the current situation, and there's a lot of speculation about this in the media at the minute, and people from all corners commentating, is what the aftermath of the coronavirus crisis will be in terms of, politics and economics and society and science, and the implications that might have for our future development as a species. And I feel that as much as you just alluded to, that if we were psychologically in a better condition collectively, we would do better with sort of huge efforts like, off-planet exploration. That if there is any dystopian tendency to authoritarian control, that tends to shut that down. We need to have exciting competing visions of the future. People saying, what about this? And someone else saying, well, maybe, but what about this? So like more people working on the project so we have more chance of success. And I think if people emotionally and psychologically and even physically feel very controlled and very shut down, then their future consciousness is shut down as well. And it becomes about survival, and they go down the hierarchy of needs, and we could find ourselves taking a backward step in a big way.
Yeah. Something that I bring up in my book, Future Consciousness, is that it seems to me that the most important factor to focus on in order to create a better future overall for humanity is to evolve ourselves mentally and in terms of our ethical character. That we need to focus more on the psychological evolution of humanity and not so much on looking at gadgets and material supports. Not that that isn't important, but not so much of an emphasis on it and more of an emphasis on the psychological, develop wisdom and future consciousness and courage and optimism and other human qualities. And so I don't disagree with you. That is critical. And I think that in our preferable future, we should evolve psychologically with much greater vigor and focus. And that will make the economic, the ecological, the technological elements of reality more balanced and manageable and sane and wise. We are cyborgs, but we need to be wise cyborgs. We are ecological beings. We need to be wise ecological beings. And I think we are creatures of outer space. We live in outer space, and we just need to be wise with it. We need to get better with our minds on all of that. So that would be the good psychological that would be the good utopias or the positive utopias for the future, not a world that's calm and peaceful and everybody agrees, but rather a world in which our minds have gotten better and not just our appliances.
I couldn't agree more with your sentiments there about individual development, personal development. Like you said at the top of the hour, what are you going to do? What are you going to be once we move beyond this? And whether the future of the species is something like Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End, where we ultimately cease to be physical beings, the point is that we're clearly on a journey somewhere. And like a lot of the classic sci-fi that you mentioned earlier, there are classical values, actually, like heroism and risk-taking in there that are very, very valuable, and I think inherent to us as a species that are not very fashionable at the moment in our culture of safety and our culture of fear. But these are things that we should not, I think, be ashamed at all about cultivating within ourselves at this time and as we move forward, because those are the things that are going to make a difference. Just seeking safety and stability above all else is like a form of death, really.
Well, it's very low on Maslow's hierarchy, if you believe in Maslow's hierarchy. But in fact, when you look at Maslow's psychology, basically Maslow said there's two different kinds of human motives. There's the motives that center around stability and the motives that center around growth. Both of them are factors in the human psyche, but the stability motives, the need motives, are on the bottom of the hierarchy. The actualization growth motives are on top of the hierarchy. And we need the growth side as much as we need the stability side. But people want stability, and stability gets connected up with fear too, of course. People could be fearful of change. If you believe in Maslow's psychology, then clearly we need to have that growth dimension as well as the stability dimension.
Yes, and that is, as I say, is my concern, is that people may be tempted now, maybe for very obvious practical reasons, to hunker down and to look to, survival, what they require in the moment. And, especially if they suddenly find themselves that they no longer have a job no longer have an income.
Right.
And against that background, they're already feeling emotionally and psychologically fragile because everything's been shaken up. But
Right.
it's down to some of us at least to offer different ways of thinking about this and different visions.
Yeah.
Because that's how that again, we're right back to being in a science fiction novel. That's how, if the species gets through any of this, that's how it gets through. It doesn't take 100% of the species to make it through. It just takes enough to make a difference, because each one of us is like a cell within the brain of humanity, and that, however little we might feel at times and however ineffectual and what we say and think doesn't have an effect, it does.
And it clearly does have an effect upon your own particular life. The first character strand of future consciousness is, in my mind, is self-responsibility. Taking responsibility for your own future and not relinquishing it to external forces or figures. If you can believe that the future you're going to have is going to be a consequence of what you do to a great degree, then that is very empowering and uplifting, and actually is a very effective way to come at the future. Just as a starting point. If we feel like we're victims, if we externalize our locus of control, we can have an impact on our futures. We shouldn't simply feel like we're being buffeted about by forces that we have nothing to do to control and have an impact on. Self-responsibility for the future, that is a critical character virtue. And also, as you were talking, it hit me, there's a quote from Arthur C. Clarke again, another interesting one, which is, the reason why the dinosaurs went extinct is because they didn't have a good space program. So they didn't see the meteor coming, the meteor coming. Now, part of the reason why we may go extinct is because we don't have a good future consciousness program, thinking out ahead and not just worrying about the here and now, because the future keeps coming at us. And in the future, there's all different kinds of things that could happen. There's the cartoon that's going around right now where two scientists are standing there and one's wiping their head and saying, as this little curve comes down, great day, we finally got through this damn coronavirus, pandemic, okay? And right behind the two of them is this giant mountain that's coming at them with the caption on top, climate change. The critical variable that allows for our success now is our capacity to learn from the past and anticipate out into the future. And if we simply want to focus on the present, we're no different than frogs. And we could live in the swamp, and that'll be fine and chirp every night, but that's as far as we're ever going to get. We have this ability to think out ahead, to remember the past, and that's very important for our success and evolution as a species.
Splendid. Well, Tom, that might be a very good point on which to end today. So now your books, a couple of which we've mentioned, they're easily and widely available all over the web and people's favourite sources for books. But before we sign off, if you'd like to just share details of your website, anything you're working on, anything at all you'd like to put out there.
Yeah, as I said, I'm the director of the Center for Future Consciousness. My website is, in fact, centerforfutureconsciousness.com. I just finished up volumes 2 and 3 of my history of science fiction. Volume 2 is The Time Machine to Metropolis, Fritz Lang's movie Metropolis. Volume 3 is Superman to Star Maker. I've just started working on Volume 4 now, which is going to be the Golden Age, the Silver Age, and the New Wave. So I'm working on that, and I keep doing interviews with various people and speaking engagements on both science fiction and future consciousness. And the two are interrelated. They're connected together in my mind.
Wonderful. Well, once again, Tom, thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you.
Utopia. 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 Planet of your wildest dreams. Welcome to Utopia, where all your needs are catered for anticipated, calculated. All your wants are monitored. Program computer formulated. We know you will be very happy here. Nobody has ever complained. Yes. But we always encourage making utopian love. Welcome to Utopia. 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 Welcome to Utopia.